Cheers guys, Epix 911. Welcome to VR A to Z, episode 4. In this episode, we're going to talk about VR Locomotion. Taking something that comes so natural to us, so second nature, our ability as a species, a very defining ability as a species to walk upright on two legs and move that over into VR and still have it feel natural. That's the challenge that we're up against. I think we're going to get there, but I think it's going to be a while yet. So in this episode, we're going to take a little look at the history. We're going to look at a snapshot of the different options that are out there locomotion-wise, and a little bit of speculation for the future. Now, generally, before we dive in, there's a couple of ways to tackle the challenge of locomotion. One way is simply to ignore it. And that doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. It could be by design. For example, a racing game. Any kind of cockpit-based game, well, it does away with the need for walking locomotion as a game mechanic because what you're doing in-game matches what you're doing in the real world. That also ups the immersion factor hugely. Frees up the devs to focus on other areas. And as someone enjoying the experience, you can even ratchet it up on a lot of these and make it feel that much more realistic. Say it's a racing game, well, add a cockpit that has hydraulics. One that lets you feel every bump or turn in the road. We're actually going to look at one of those units a little later in this show. It's pretty damn sweet. And then the other way, of course, is simply dealing with it and try to come up with a VR locomotion mechanic that feels as natural as possible while still catering to those who get VR sickness, which itself can vary from just mild discomfort all the way to full-blown nausea and hugging the porcelain throne. And until we have a permanent solution for that, and some other biochemistry woes, we're going to probably continue to see VR experiences that offer multiple forms of locomotion, i.e. teleportation for the people who have to deal with the VR sickness and a smooth option for the rest of us. You'll see in the show how many different options there are out there. There's a ton. And sure, they make it look easy as hell on Star Trek: The Next Generation, but that's fantasy. It's science fiction. If you allow your imagination, you got to think, even the engineers in that show, there was a time when they had to tackle that challenge. That's where we're at, tackling the challenge. All those different solutions, there's an end goal to them. There's an objective there to make it feel as smooth and as natural as possible. That's what this show is about. Guys, let's dive into the world of VR locomotion.
Locomotion is a fundamental aspect and requirement of VR. It's also one of the most difficult things to get right. The biggest reason for that is that there are multiple genres of gaming, and each of those has its own challenges in the form of gameplay. The easiest form of locomotion, and consequently the most immersive experiences in VR, are provided via cockpit-style VR games. Which makes sense when you think of it, as what you're doing in-game matches exactly what you're doing in the real world. Your brain doesn't have to constantly reconcile your position in-game versus the real world. Say you're playing Project Cars 2, and in real life, you're sitting on your swivel chair. Just being seated is pretty immersive compared to standing games, which all have their own locomotion methods and requirements. Little tweaks like maybe a hydraulic racing cockpit that moves in sync with your VR vehicle, that notches the realism and immersion up even higher. Having your VR wheel or HOTAS in the same position in real life likewise makes the experience even more immersive. In short, cockpit VR experiences are some of the most immersive you can have in VR because locomotion really isn't a factor. I'd go as far as saying it's also one of the safer ways to experience VR, unless, of course, you are this guy. with room scale, we're having to migrate our bipedalism over into VR, and that's where VR Locomotion currently falls way short. Not only are we having to come up with an accurate form of locomotion, we need to ensure it's safe, and thanks to Chaperone and Guardian, it's mostly safe. Then again, just standing still can be an issue for some people. Even with a system like Chaperone or Guardian, there's also the issue of the borders themselves. If you've already committed to the punch or kick, the warnings simply come too late. Some games, like fighting games, have you punching and flailing around like a lunatic. Here's Nady playing Gorn with a lot more enthusiasm than I've ever been able to muster, and it cost him a Vive controller. So it's generally recommended that you ensure there's a buffer between the borders of your room scale and any delicate possessions you own. Ideally, it would be awesome if VR room scale could double for any size of virtual location, wherein you could use any form of walking, jogging, or running and still be safe and not have to go beyond the borders that you initially configured for yourself. Currently, though, we're up against the technological limitations and varying body chemistry. Having smooth locomotion feel immersive only benefits those who don't get VR sickness. Technology-wise, there are 3 areas that I think of that all need to improve in parallel. First of these, simply processing power. Currently, when it comes to processing power, mobile tech is generally a step behind the larger and more robust desktop technology. All kinds of drivers from economics to gaming already ensure that processing power improves year over year. Hardware is improvements in everything from wireless tech and optics through to wearable haptic technology and all points between. Finally, you've got rendering, which boils down to how many pixels and how quickly we can relay those to our eyes. Currently, stereoscopic 1080p is the standard for VR rendering, but as we move forward, this number will increase, as will the other areas. Coming back around to virtual reality locomotion, given that we haven't solved VR sickness, many developers use teleportation along with a tweakable form of smooth locomotion in their experiences. While we know there are multiple forms of smooth locomotion, and we're going to get back to those in a few minutes, there are also a few types of teleportation styles in VR. To start with, you've got the default teleportation, which generally involves moving a target reticle around an environment with one of your motion track controllers, and then generally any place you can't move to within your play space or due to game timing reasons will make the target reticle render in red. That indicates you cannot teleport to that location. If you can teleport there, it's generally rendered in green. You face the direction you were when you first teleported. That's probably the most common form of teleportation locomotion currently used in VR. Then there's also reticle rectangular bounding box teleportation. This involves moving the target reticle, which also has a rectangle around it called a bounding rectangle. You can rotate this to determine your destination facing direction once you teleport. Next up, there's energy-limited teleportation. This is used in games where you have opponents, and unlimited teleportation capability would give you an unfair advantage. Raw data, for example, Sorrento, examples of this type of teleportation. Lastly, there's point-and-click tethered teleportation. You move the reticle around to teleport to that spot, but instead of instantly appearing there, you move to that point slowly. The game Budget Cuts, as an example, allows you to view the destination with a drone-style spy camera prior to you committing to the teleport. Next up, we have smooth locomotion. I'm not going to go into crazy detail here. If you want that, Bumble has a great video. He goes into all these different smooth locomotion and teleportation methods, and not only shows you, but goes into super hyper detail on them. We're just going to skim through them, starting with Walkabout, which, exactly like it sounds, has you using actual footsteps in your room scale that are then translated one-to-one into the VR experience. There's also run in place, and again, just like it sounds, involves you running on a single spot to move you in the VR experience. Variations of this, one of them cross-country ski, where you use your motion track controllers as if you were cross-country skiing, and arm swinging, which is kind of like power walking or speed walking. You move your arms, swinging them in an exaggerated fashion to move you forward. Then there's the ninja run. You lean forward and you've got both controllers extended straight arm behind you, almost as if you were in the air after a ski jump. General smooth locomotion usually involves one trackpad which has left-right to turn left-right and up-down to move forward or backward. A variation on this, used in the Talos principle, uses two controllers, or it can use up to two controllers. One does exactly what I just said. Up-down is forward or backward. Left-right turns you. But the other controller's trackpad or analog nub, instead of turning you when you go left or right, it strafes you left or right. So in effect, you've got motion on both controllers. The Max Planck Institute, as far back as 2014, was studying a method called
redirected walking, which means basically while you walk in a virtual environment, we gently rotate it and change things. That you think you walk through a little village, you go straight left, right, but in fact you're just walking in a circle here, but you don't know it. And that's the stuff which that's what our basic research is about. What are the thresholds? How fast can we fake this world rotation until you notice it? Or where's the threshold that if below that you still believe that you are just walking forever through a city, basically. When you walk 1 meter, we maybe just move you half a meter. And what's really powerful is also to manipulate rotations. So especially when you go against the wall and you make a 90 degrees turn, we can actually make you turn more than 90 degrees, and you still think you just made a 90 degrees turn. And that's a bit the tricks you use then to keep people in this space.
There's a few games and experiences that are using variations of this. One is Unseen Diplomacy. What this method does is it maps the game based on your available room space. For example, it will configure the game map so that it feels as if you have a lot more space at your disposal than you actually do. Say the game starts you at the bottom center of your room space. In the game, the map will then have you double back either to the left or right to that spot when you get to the end of the initial room or hallway, and then it continues that. You're always turning or doubling back in such a way that you're going over an area that you actually have available to you in real life. The challenge there is you've got to be subtle, because if it's too abrupt, it doesn't feel realistic. This brings us to locomotion techniques that utilize hardware. Currently, 2 types of locomotion hardware are in the research and development phase. First up, we have footwear, like what Jamie Heineman of Mythbusters fame is working on. His idea is for footwear to function as a treadmill would. Wearing these shoes, you would walk as per normal, only the tech on the underside of the shoe takes care of the rest. To date, no workable prototype exists, although a fundraising campaign to develop such a prototype is underway. That leaves us with the currently quite bulky VR Locomotion treadmills. A few functioning commercial versions exist, and they generally take one of 2 forms, either a movable surface or a frictionless, smooth, concave type surface. This is the Cat VR, and it uses the latter, a smooth, concave surface that with the right footwear allows you to effectively run or walk on the spot. Then we have the Strider VR. It utilizes several hundred small trackballs over which your footwear moves. It functions almost identical to how a mouse or a trackball functions, just via an open design. Next up, we have the Virtuix Omni. This one functions similar to the Cat VR in that it also uses a concave smooth surface. And lastly, the Cyberith Virtualizer. It uses an extremely smooth disc. It's not concave, it's flat. That requires you wear your socks, so just regular smooth cotton socks. Now, each of these takes up a pretty big footprint in terms of space in your home, and even the smaller Virtuix and Cyberith, the last two that we looked at, are about as large as a medium-sized desk. They also require varying non-natural walking techniques. However, they do deliver on the promise of unlimited locomotion in a predefined space. That's something that none of the other types of locomotion can lay claim to.
Well, guys, as you can see, there are a metric crap ton of different options for VR locomotion. Some of them, they're really only to address motion sickness. Unless it's a gameplay mechanic, is there really a need for teleportation? The answer to that would be, yeah, until we figure out the biochemistry behind VR sickness and a permanent way to address it, we're going to continue to have experiences that offer multiple modes, teleportation, and then some type of smooth locomotion option. When it comes to smooth locomotion options, there are a ton out there, and it seems muddled. It seems like chaos. We're not getting anywhere. But every single method is research and development that's moving us forward. Now, there's a few of you I spoke to that said speculating about the future is a fool's errand, and I agree. It's rarely accurate, but it's fun, and it's also a driving force for a lot of developers. Without that end goal, that promise of VR locomotion that feels as natural as walking in real life, what's the point? So right now, yeah, we're stuck with stuff. But what about the future? Well, I remember being a teen, high school years, mid to late 80s, thinking, holy crap, by the year 2000, guaranteed 1 or 2 moon bases. We're also going to have ships patrolling. I've said that before. And yeah, none of that came to pass. But we have made advancements. We've made a lot of advancements in all kinds of different areas. And I will always love that quote. Future advances will come in those areas that we today are not wise enough to predict. So true. Advances do come in those areas. You look at cell phones and how we've made technology smaller. Not necessarily always better, but there have been improvements. You can now speak long distance to somebody on the other side of the globe, painlessly, effortlessly, and do it without racking up long distance charges. The ability to speak to people via a video phone style option, that was the stuff of daydreams 20, 30 years ago, and here we are doing it. So what about VR? What does it look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? I don't have a freaking clue, but I do have some guesses. And the safest guess usually is to just take current technology and imagine that further down the line. Screen resolution, that's pretty much a gimme. It's going to improve. We will one day see 4K as a standard and 8K and so on. It's going to happen. It might not happen fast, but it will happen. Field of view ever increasing towards that point where it looks and feels like human vision. Take the Pimax as an example. It's yet another consumer product that's increased field of view over the current generation. If you're talking about the Rifts and your Vives of the world, even your PlayStation VRs. Processing power, that's only going to get faster. Is the end solution going to be wireless, or is it going to be based on technology built in to an HMD? I think those options are going to exist, but generally mobile solutions are a step or two behind full-blown desktop models. I think the first really amazing virtual reality of the future solution is going to be wireless. And it's going to communicate with a very powerful computer still sitting somewhere in the building that you're using. Or maybe it's cloud-based and we figure out how to do that with minimal latency. Audio is going to improve. Game engines are going to improve. It's going to be pretty damn good. And man, do I wish I was 20 again, just to be able to have a do-over from this point in time moving forward. Millennials watching this, lucky as hell. Sure, I got to see some great bands in concert, but you guys get to see the real magic, because it's gonna be magical. And when I'm in the retirement home, you guys are still gonna be cruising in middle age with some pretty damn sweet tech. And yeah, I'm envious as hell. Let me know in the comments below, guys, what you see as the future of VR. How do you see it progressing? And of course, when it comes to VR Locomotion, what does the end goal look like to you? Guys, thanks for joining me for this episode. Catch you in the next one. Cheers.